We now bring in Fox News contributor David Webb and OutKick host Tomi Lahren. Great to see both of you on this day. David, just your reaction to what you've seen today. 78 counts against President Trump in total, but these four in particular are based upon the analysis of so many legal minds, a gross overreach and political, not completely political and nothing but.
Well, it is completely political, Dagan. And when you look at these indictments, many of them are actually photocopy indictments, the first round under Alvin Bragg, even where we are today. And I would put this question to anyone. Find the penal code that covers the additional four that Jack Smith laid out yesterday. Was there anything to this? There wasn't. There's no penal code to support this. And like you said, whether it's a Jonathan Turley, Andrew McCarthy, Alan Dershowitz, others out there that are certainly more trustworthy when it comes to law and the way law should be applied, that's important. But this isn't about that. This is not about winning the case. And when you look at Jack Smith, it's clear it's not about winning the case with what he did with the Virginia governor. He was overturned on that. It's about piling on Donald Trump. It's about making Trump our enemy as they see it. And look, while Donald Trump at times may not be his own best friend and sometimes maybe his own worst enemy because he can go off the cuff, he is not America's worst enemy. The problem is he stands out there and he said something when he first ran that they're not working for you. And that was an indictment of Washington, D.C., not just the Democrats, but the failures. When you look at the people who are standing against him now on the Republican side, Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski, you look at Susan Collins, some that are no longer in the Senate, Pat Toomey, for example, and others that voted to convict Trump. I would ask Mitt Romney or anyone else, what is the actual violation of law? You voted to convict Trump. You knew it was a hoax then. We all know it's a hoax now. And where do you stand? And when you contrast that with what we have learned with the meeting with Devin Archer and the House committee, and when you look at the evidence, the pictures, the text messages, the emails, the testimony given in prior cases, where is the parity when it comes to our legal system? It isn't. And for my conservative friends, stop saying that Jack Smith cares about being overthrown. He doesn't. He knows that if he piles on, he's down for the struggle, and he's going to continue to do this. He's proven it before, as well as the others that will come along in this case.
Tomi Lahren, when we watch Donald Trump give his campaign speeches, oftentimes he'll say, they're not coming for me. They're actually coming for you. And that has become more and more true as you look at prosecutors going after, or the FBI going after pro-lifers, parents who have protested at school board meetings. A number of folks have been targeted who we never thought would be targeted by our federal government. I'm shocked at the backbone, the kahunas that Donald Trump has shown when he's facing decades in prison, multiple charges in multiple jurisdictions, and he's still standing there fighting back, pushing back. And I want your opinion on this, but it almost seems like he believes he truly is fighting for the everyman. He is fighting for justice, and his victory can restore order to the country. It seems like that's what's driving him. What's your take?
Yeah, Donald Trump, since the beginning, since he came down that escalator and announced his candidacy for president, the first time, he has done best when he's not only under pressure, but when he is backed into the corner, when they are rattling his cage. That's when Donald Trump shines, and that's why he has the following that he has. That's why he transformed the Republican Party into the Make America Great Again movement, and that's why it's so strong, and that's why these indictments are actually solidifying support among Republicans around Donald Trump. But I do have to caution the audience and the Trump supporters and the Republicans out there, be cautious, because this could all be a trap. I agree with David Webb that this isn't necessarily about getting a conviction, but it's about the perception of Donald Trump when it comes to a general election. I think the Democrats want to run against Donald Trump. So not only do they want to damage him, but they want to make him our nominee. They see the polls. They know that he does best when he's under attack. So I think we have to make sure we're playing chess and not checkers, because the Democrats, as much as I believe that a lot of them are evil, they are not stupid. They see this thing from a bird's eye view, and we better be seeing it from where they're seeing it to avoid falling into the trap.
To Tomi's point, David, it's a win-win for the Democrats in control and charge. So either President Trump is in jail or he winds up the nominee.
I would just note, on that point, Tomi, they had that same philosophy in 2016 as well. It didn't pan out too well for them. He actually won the election.
I do want, David, to get your reaction to this. Al Sharpton was on MSNBC yesterday where he attempted to make an analogy between our founding fathers and Trump. But the only thing he proved was that he knows paltry little about history.
Can you imagine our reading that James Madison or Thomas Jefferson tried to overthrow the government so they could stay in power? That's what we're looking at. We're looking at American history, and how it will play out is going to be very important.
David, you have to say something.
It's not. It's nonsensical what Al Sharpton says. Much of his career is about nonsensical things. So I would push him aside, but look at what he's pushing out. And to Tomi's point, what they're pushing out to the American people. Again, Donald Trump at times is not his best friend, but he's not our worst enemy as a country. And whether Trump is the perfect Republican candidate or not, what he stands up to people like Al Sharpton and the few viewers at MSNBC or at any of the other letter networks that push this dribble out to their base, is he stands for the people who say, you're not working for me, who's going to fight for me? And they don't like that because these elitists, these amoral elitists, including some Republicans, simply want to maintain their power at our expense. Trump is a focal point. We, really the republic, the constitutional republic, is their goal, and they will work together effectively as they did to get Biden elected in order to achieve their goals. So we have to play the long game. Tomi's absolutely right. Matter of fact, Tomi, I'm going to one-up you, which it's hard to do as it is, but I want three-dimensional chess. I want them to look very long-term on this and realize that there is a leapfrog game being played beyond Donald Trump when you talk about indoctrinating young people, when you talk about perverting our youth, when you talk about changing our culture, when you talk about the fake trans ideology, CRT, corporate ESG, add all these things together and look at the tentacles of a bigger, grander strategy. And to Tomi's earlier point, they're not stupid. They're evil. They're not stupid.
Well, I'll just say Al Sharpton's statement was a little stupid in that we had revolutionaries who fought for their own power to defeat the Brits. But I think you're both right. They're not dumb. And Tomi, I wonder if the media has learned their lesson from 2016 and into 2017. When they give Donald Trump a platform, he can take it and he can sell himself and his ideas to the American people. I wonder now if their strategy is, we're going to tell the American people who Donald Trump is, that he has all of these indictments, he has all this potential time in prison, he's a really bad, evil man. But they're not going to allow Donald Trump to actually speak directly to their audience, because if he does, he usually wins voters.
Yeah, you know, they underestimated Trump in 2015 and 2016, to your point, and they gave him actually a lot of airtime in the beginning. Everybody wanted to hear from Donald Trump. I mean, the man was on SNL, for goodness sakes. They underestimated him. They thought he was just a joke, a reality TV star, and they quickly found out that that was not the case. But now I think that they've got their game sharpened, and they are looking at things a little bit more strategically. I do believe that the future of our country is at stake if we don't rein in some of these entities that are being politically weaponized. And that just doesn't have to do with Donald Trump. It also has to do with big tech, collusion with this current White House. There's a lot at play here, and the American people and our right to free speech are at stake. I would also say, if Donald Trump wants to get his message out and shape the narrative, I hope he shows up to that debate on August 23rd on Fox News, because the American people, they need to hear from him.
Absolutely, they do. And this is President Trump has the huge advantage of the American people have, from a policy perspective, I experienced him governing for 4 years. And before COVID, what happened to the economy. But this is a different economic age with inflation, and whoever takes office after Joe Biden will have to undo the vast expansion of government, not just in terms of regulation, but the subsidies, over $1 trillion just in climate and green subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. But Guy Benson earlier brought up the CBS News poll that only a third of people said that the economy was good. And that's exactly right, because that's all of the poll numbers line up with the actual economic numbers, because people are not stupid. People experience this every single day. 70% of people said they have not gotten a raise because people have not gotten a raise since Joe Biden took office. And it's this White House that has the audacity every single day to talk to the American people and blithely lie over and over again, whether it's about Afghanistan or the economy, and tell them, how good it should feel. And the numbers are upside down in terms of his polling, Biden's, on the economy, because like the student loan forgiveness, no moratorium, only a third of this country have four-year college degrees. There are 2/3 of this nation has no college degree. So again, Biden and company have willingly screwed those people, and they know it, regardless of what comes out of his blathering mouth. David?
Let me try some simple common sense, which we all seem to excel at here, and I know most of the American people really do. No matter who you are, let's say you're that 1/3 that believes things are going well, you're still living your economic reality. Biden pushes out on social media, so does Kamala Harris, that they've created 13.2 million jobs. So simple question, if there are 13.2 million jobs and there are new jobs, who hired them? If you have a count, the data has a source. Provide the source. See, the American people are living the reality, even that 1/3 that believes otherwise, whether they admit it or not, when they go to the grocery store, the gas pump, when they go to pay their energy bill, or when they look for the raise that lets them move ahead in life, it's not there. So no matter what poll is taken, economic reality is not separated by a poll. And Dagan, think about the business of the nation and the economy of the nation, something you've done for many years, and explain to people in simple terms what kitchen table, what real investment structures, venture capital, pension funds that are going down because, frankly, the markets are not a reflection of the reality. Companies losing value, losing hundreds of millions, billions, and then trillions of dollars of value lost. When you look at the drivers of this economy and the reality of this economy, no matter what you believe, you're living the economic reality, and it is a lie from the Biden administration. And if they have it, provide the source of the data. Show us the money, so to speak. They don't have it. But when the jobs numbers come out this week, they'll try to tout something. They'll play with the U3 numbers. But what's the reality out there when people can't get jobs that pay them to actually live a decent life?
And as they look at their own lives, if they're doing well, they have the freedom to care about the environment and green energy and electric cars, and they want to welcome people through the southern border and come into their community. If they can't pay for milk and gas in their car, they care about politics and someone who's going to fix their lives for them. And I think many will reflect back to what kind of economy was here during President Trump's tenure. But Tomi, we had a conversation here about Democrats are smart. The media is smart, and they're elevating Donald Trump. They know that the more they charge him, the country be damned, but the more they charge him, he'll rise in the polls as a Republican candidate. In your estimation, is Donald Trump in a position where with these charges, he can win the primary but also win the general election? Or do you think Republicans are better positioned to run someone else other than Donald Trump, or Ron DeSantis, say?
Yeah, so here's the problem. His message right now seems to be, I'm getting screwed over, and you should care that I'm getting screwed over. And the Republican Party, the Trump supporters, we care about that. Average Americans should care about that. But as we talked about the economy and how average everyday Americans are struggling, I don't know how that message is going to translate in a general election. I believe that during the Trump administration, the economy was thriving. So if he is indeed our nominee, I would hope that that is his prevailing message, is that I can fix this economy, I can secure our southern border, I can get us out of endless wars. He has to lead with that if he is our nominee, because simply saying I'm getting screwed over is not going to win a general election like it might win a Republican primary. So that is going to be the challenge. Can he put ego aside? I know it's difficult, and I know that he feels that he must get revenge, but if he is our nominee, he must put that to the side, because he's got to reach those Americans out there that are struggling to pay the mortgage, the Americans out there that are struggling to afford milk and eggs and find baby formula. He's going to have to pivot. That is going to be his challenge. And I think it would be much easier for someone like a Ron DeSantis to have that message. But if Donald Trump is our nominee, we better make that clear that we have to lead with the economy, not just everything is politicized, I'm being persecuted. Not going to win a general, I'm sorry to say.
Point well made.
Indeed, and certainly, David, there were the charges today in this administration, the charges against two individuals, members of the military, I think it was two, involved in espionage. They were Chinese, but this administration has been nowhere to be found in terms of standing up to China's aggression, in whether it was economic aggression. But that's something that President Trump can stand on. But again, you have to reverse all of the harm that the fecklessness of the Biden administration has brought on this country.
Yeah, and to some degree, the fecklessness combined of the Biden administration, the D.C. establishment and structure, the political class, and even some of the Republicans. Back to the thing that Donald Trump mentioned right off the bat, they're not working for you. As far as China, and we have to look at this from a variety of perspectives, the Biden administration and Joe Biden himself are compromised in different ways, whether it's about money transfers, investments, dealing with Chinese Communist Party-backed companies and more, or Burisma executives, or selling of access. There's also another level of compromise for Joe Biden. Joe Biden's wanted this position since the day he's been in the Senate. He was out of his first campaign because of plagiarism. He's willing to lie, cheat, and steal. He's a skilled political liar. That type of compromise means that anyone who wants to bend themselves to their cause, they will accept to do it in any way. And what we can't do as Americans is forget that we are better as a cohesive unit, even in our agreements and disagreements, especially in our disagreements, because if America does not survive this period effectively and begin to reverse course, which no president will do in one term, but if we as a country don't begin to reverse course, and we don't have a governance structure, that means governors, that means the House of Representatives, that means agencies that are working correctly, that means laws and regulations. If that doesn't get set on course, then the country will suffer for decades to come. We're in a dirty fight. You look at where the left has taken hold in this country, and where they've taken hold in not just universities, but in our levers of government. That is the death of the nation. And if that happens, where do you go next?
And just
who's the next refuge for everyone, whether you're an illegal alien or someone looking to come to this country?
And just to clarify, it was two Navy sailors in Southern California arrested and accused of providing military secrets to the Chinese.
So, Tomi, I want to get one last question in here for you. So the two most valuable things that we have in a campaign is money and time. And you never get time back. You can always get more money. And I know you don't get a minute, an hour, a week, a month back. And every moment you have before people cast their ballots is critical for you to make contact with them, to touch them, to do your rallies, to shake their hand. What impact do these cases have on Donald Trump's ability to be on the campaign trail and to focus on the voter and focus on the rally as opposed to being focused on these criminal charges?
Yeah, that's part of the problem. You know, as we got report earlier this week, $40 million have gone to fund these legal battles thus far. We know that he's also set up a separate legal defense fund. So that is concerning when you're burning through that kind of money, when that's your single largest expense is your legal fees. That is a very large concern for the Trump team. We know that there are other candidates that are also hemorrhaging money. You know, DeSantis has had to lean out his campaign a little bit, has a lot of money, but also spending a lot of money. So that's going to be important. But I don't think we can also miss a very important part of this, whether our nominee is Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or somebody else. If Republicans in general do not get our ground game intact and we are not working on voter registration and ballot harvesting where it's legal, pushing early voting where it is possible, we will lose. So that's why it's so important that the RNC also gets their act together, puts their money and their time where their mouths are, and gets out knocking doors and making sure that we have a grassroots effort to support Republican candidates, no matter what the candidate is. If you have an America First candidate, we better get out there and we better get our election strategy in line and ready to go, because without it, it doesn't matter who our candidate is, we will lose.
I'll say it, Tommy. Ronna McDaniel better walk that talk, because going on TV and talking about it, you know, that chicken doesn't lay eggs. Tomi Lahren, thank you so much. Great to see you. David
You're
Webb.
exactly right.
David Webb.
Great to see you guys.
Great to see you both. Thank you so much.